I found something in the archive that I would like to share with you. Let's take a look. I found a yearbook from 1964. Now you might be thinking, why is he sharing with us a yearbook from 1964? I'll tell you why. I was looking through to find a very specific person, and I found out that when I was looking through the Centenary archives that the yearbooks are collected there. So I was like, well, this person will be in the yearbook. Have you spotted her yet? Let's go in a little closer. How about now? Mhm. There she is. Debbie Harry, graduated 1965.
Was it love and it was a gas? Soon turned out that a heart.
And stop that. So I was excited to hear about that. And I thought, well, how do I find materials on this person? Sometimes the archive, and archive's a new word for you, think of it as the way that librarians curate and collect materials about the history of a place or a subject. And so every university will have an archive about its own history and then archive about other special collections, other important historic materials. So I was thinking, you've got to have something. I mean, you have when you have the lead singer of Blondie graduate from your institution, there's got to be something there, some sort of memorabilia, something in the record. And so I thought, well, I don't live in New Jersey. How do I access it? Maybe there's a digital archive, and there is. And so there's this important aspect of digitization, of taking materials that we have physically and recording them into the digital record. And that is more than just scanning. It has to do with making sure that machines can read it so that we can search for it, because I was able to search for the name Harry because I figured she'd go by Deborah Ann Harry. Well, they're not Debbie Harry yet. And so we know she graduated in 1965, which means she probably started in 1963. And that means maybe there'd be something about her in the 1964 yearbook. And there is. Apparently having to do with the sorority. And now, when I discovered this, I got pretty excited, told my wife about it, said, I think I'm going to put this in the lecture. We're doing archives this week. And she said, are your students going to know who Debbie Harry is? And I said, they're going to know after this lecture. So that's an example of an archive as a curation of historic materials so people can have access to them. And it's specifically an example of a digital archive where those materials have been recorded and digitized and made available on the internet. So people from different regions who aren't even associated with the university can access them. Another example is if you look behind me, there's that priest, Gerard Manley Hopkins. That's a poet I work on. And his archive is strangely in Spokane, Washington. I say strangely because he was an English priest who died in Ireland. And so the Jesuits, specifically Father Bischoff, collected his materials and took it to Gonzaga University in Washington State. And so his materials are in Spokane. If you want to access them, if you want to see some of his original writing, I wanted to look at specifically things from his time as a novice. I had to travel to Spokane. I had to get a grant and to get funding to go fly out there and spend a week and request the boxes. I had to look at the archive and request specific boxes so I could go through them. But the pandemic hits and we don't have access to necessarily that kind of stuff. We're having stay-at-home orders, and so how could people still research? And that's another reason why the digital archive can be so important. And Gonzaga, that's where that picture is from. It's a print from one of their materials, has a digital archive where they digitize some of the materials. And so there's this interplay between the physical holdings of a place and the work of digitizing them, making them where they can be read by machines, making them where they're accessible to people who have screen readers and things like that. But that's not all that's going on with an archive. We're thinking about the archive as the curation of the past. But any curation is an interpretation. Decisions are being made, and there are silences. And so another important thing is to examine in the digital archive and in the idea of critical digital humanities is not just what's available at the archive, but what's ignored, what's kept out. And that's where the optional podcast can come in for this week. You can hear from Dorothy Berry, who's an archivist, and she's now the curator at Smithsonian. And what she's looking at is where there are areas of gaps, especially about narratives of enslavement, and she had a research project where she looked at archives in Missouri and was seeing where this idea of maybe there being less slavers and less persons who were enslaved, and seeing how that wasn't the full story. So she looks at gaps. And this comes into maybe an idea of imagined futures. We think about the archive often as that's the past and the objective past, but it's not objective, it's an interpretation. It's something where someone has said, I will preserve that, because preservation and digitization takes money and labor. So certain things have been preserved and things have been ignored or missed. So you need archivists like Dr. Berry to find those and uncover them. And so it's not just about the past, but it's a way of bringing together cultural heritage to enable a community to have its future. That's an important part of it too. So we'll be thinking about archives this week in those ways. How does it preserve the past and make it available for others? But how are things hidden through interpretation, through the colonial legacy of what's called the Imperial Archive? Because in the past, materials might be brought together from the different areas subjugated under an empire to reinforce imperial control. And you can think about it in the sense of, where are different marbles? Where are different historical artifacts? Are they repatriated to where they were made, to where they are an example of cultural heritage, or are they kept in an imperial archive, such as a museum? So not only is there an archive in the sense of recording the past as an interpretation, and maybe interpretation with imperial and colonial legacies, but there's also the archive as a way of preserving past identities for the sake of reimagining possible futures. So that's part of what we're going to be thinking about this week, is how can we use archives for our own research, but also how does our idea of what an archive is affect and maybe foreclose our avenues research, or enable us to use our research for kind of what's called a presentist concern. What presentism means, or sometimes we call it strategic presentism, is thinking through, how can my knowledge of the past and my attempts to uncover silences in the past, an archival record, lead towards justice now, lead towards community building now. And so what we'll be doing this week is, you'll start thinking about, as we begin our textual analysis unit, start thinking about what kind of text you want to examine, what do you want to explore. And we'll slowly build from working on the text we're going to use, to using Voyant to analyze it, to finally using Spiral to share with others your insights.